Grieving families in Sri Lanka continue to mourn victims of Sunday's coordinated bomb attacks. Mass burials are taking place in the city of Negombo, where more than 100 people were killed. In all, 359 people are confirmed dead from those Easter Sunday attacks across the country. Sri Lanka's president is asking for the resignations of the defense secretary and the national police chief after security forces failed to act on warnings. ISIS is claiming responsibility for the attacks. A Sri Lankan official is blaming breakaway members of two obscure local extremist Muslim groups. Well, let's look at this alleged involvement in those attacks in Sri Lanka by ISIS. Our chase team has reached terrorism analyst Michael S. Smith II. He's an expert on ISIS and al-Qaeda. He's also a teaching fellow at Johns Hopkins University's Global Security Studies program, and we've reached him in Beaufort, South Carolina. Michael, great to have you on the program. I want to get right to the heart of this. ISIS, how can it still operate despite all those calls that we heard to say it was defeated?
Hi, Suhana. I think that's a trillion-dollar question, unfortunately. But what is evident is that despite having lost control of territory, and with that an ability to use perhaps its most inspirational claim of having restored and attempted to expand a so-called caliphate, despite all of that, Islamic State remains quite capable of persuading people to perpetrate mass casualty terrorist attacks in manners that it's been calling for its support base around the world to do since 2014.
So do you believe the link that we're hearing about between these bombings in Sri Lanka and ISIS, is that saleable?
Yes, I think that it's reasonable to conclude that people who were involved with the attacks, the perpetrators, were in contact with members of Islamic State. That is demonstrated simply by the fact that they were able to provide the group with a video of various perpetrators of the attacks pledging allegiance to Baghdadi. And with that, you can reasonably conclude that there was perhaps even some level of planning that occurred between people based in Sri Lanka and elsewhere in the world, perhaps even in Syria or Iraq.
And the implications of this operation, because it was so intricate, tell us that it must have taken quite some time and quite some planning. How long and how many people do you think, Michael?
Well, that's very difficult to give an easy answer to, but this was certainly a sophisticated terrorist plot. When you consider that you had near simultaneous attacks occurring around the country, when you consider that they were able to develop explosives that produced such impact, that's suggestive of interaction with people inside the group's so-called caliphate, or what used to be the caliphate. But then again, I mean, it's always possible that some of these people may have simply picked up on some of the propaganda in which Islamic State has provided instructions about how to produce very strong explosives for use in attacks like this. So right now, there are really more questions than answers available. But again, it's pretty safe to assume that there was interaction between participants, perpetrators of these attacks, and actual group members.
What about the targets, churches and more upscale hotels? What does that tell you about the planning and the preparation?
So like al-Qaeda and other groups, Islamic State, other Salafi jihadist groups, Islamic State considers Christians enemies. Islamic State has been much more vocal in its propaganda about prioritizing Christians for attacks such as these. Going back to 2015, you could see that Islamic State attempted to begin mobilizing attacks targeting churches in Europe when a member of the group who later participated in the Paris attacks provided instructions from his base in Syria to a group member who was in Paris or around Paris at the time to attempt to perpetrate an attack at a church there. Now, he botched the attack by accidentally shooting himself in the leg. Now, the next year in France, Islamic State supporters filmed themselves pledging allegiance to Baghdadi, provided the group with that footage, and then perpetrated an attack at a church in France, during which they murdered a Roman Catholic priest. Now, that occurred occurred a couple weeks after the group claimed responsibility for assassinating a Coptic priest in Egypt. And then, of course, more recently, you've seen some mass casualty attacks targeting churches that have been claimed by the group, such as the Palm Sunday plot in Egypt that targeted 2 churches. Then you've seen also attacks targeting churches in the Philippines and Indonesia. So within the propaganda, you've also seen that the group has been very explicit in providing some sort of strategic logic about why this is important for the group's support base to attempt to do as well.
Michael, final question for you. I know time is of the essence here. What are you going to be watching for in the days and the weeks even ahead? Because we know the U.S. is involved in part of the investigation in Sri Lanka right now. What are you paying particular attention to?
Well, one thing that I'm looking at is just the content of propaganda that's already been produced by the group about this particular plot. There was an image that was incorporated in some of that propaganda that appeared to be a still from a video that was produced by the group. And so far, the video footage that's been released by the group doesn't reflect that scene. So it seems that they're probably going to push out a much lengthier video or set of propaganda that offers more insights about the backgrounds of the people involved and their relationship with group members, and perhaps some more information about a larger network in Sri Lanka and perhaps elsewhere in South Asia that is affiliated with this particular network of people who are responsible for these attacks.
Great to have you on the program, and thanks for your patience, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Suhana.
Michael S. Smith II, a terrorism analyst and an expert on ISIS and al-Qaeda. Our chase team reached him in Beaufort, South Carolina.